talking today following Leeds Pride that happened over the weekend. The Socialist Party had a really strong intervention over the whole weekend of Leeds Pride. We've been actively campaigning for healthcare for all, focusing on funding for PrEP, a HIV medication I'll be talking about later, a bit later. And we've had a really good response over the weekend. I'm starting with this way, talk about as we're preparing for our intervention, we had some comments about why does the Socialist Party need to do this? Is there a point of doing demos? Isn't oppression over? We've got equal marriage, so don't LGBT people have equal rights now? And there is that view amongst some people in the LGBT community that because there's equal marriage, because we've got some protections under law in terms of the Human Rights Act and other legislation, the oppression is over, and that there's nothing else left to fight for. Pride can be a party, Pride can just be a bit of a fun fair, and there's no more places to fight. And part of the reason it's a common view is the LGBT community has achieved a lot in a very short space of time. In the last 20 odd years, we've achieved equal marriage, as I've said, although the equal marriage in the UK does have issues around, especially for trans people. We've achieved equalisation of the age of consent for LGBT people. We've been able to successfully fight for the abolishment of Thatcher's Section 28, which prohibited the promotion of LGBT lifestyles in schools, which in essence made it impossible for teachers to discuss LGBT lifestyles in any way. And because all that's happened in recent memory, because we've taken such substantial steps forward, some people might think oppression is over, but we in the Socialist Party know it isn't. You only have to look at the controversy over PrEP this week. So this week, the High Court in Britain ruled that PrEP should be funded by the NHS. Previously, there's been lots of debate and mudslinging by the NHS saying it shouldn't have to fund PrEP, it's a preventive medication, councils should be funding it, which described the fact that the NHS funds many preventative medications. So we obviously welcome the High Court ruling. PrEP is a hugely vital drug in the fight against HIV and AIDS, which has cost millions of lives across the world. When taken, it can reduce the likelihood of contracting HIV through sex by almost 90%, and could, in theory, if it was widely available to people at risk of HIV, not just gay, bisexual men, but straight people, anyone at risk of HIV, then it's possible that HIV could be a thing of the past within our lifetimes. But following that victory, there were immediate calls by the NHS that they were going to appeal that decision, and the media came out with some shockingly homophobic articles, especially the Daily Mail carried as headline news, saying that PrEP was a lifestyle drug that gay men were using the NHS to fund promiscuous lifestyles, and because that drug was being funded by the NHS, now cataract surgery for older people wouldn't be possible, and various other surgeries fighting cancer, all that kind of stuff wouldn't be possible. And we know in the Socialist Party that that's complete fabrication. There is money in society, and there is money in the system for the NHS to fund all those surgeries. It shouldn't be a case of pitting patient against patient, and that's why we're out campaigning on at Leeds Pride. But that's not the only issue that's been affecting LGBT people. In the UK, the massive cuts to schools and public services have had a really crippling effect on vital LGBT services. Lots of services like homeless services and LGBT people are at high risk of homelessness. They make up a substantial proportion of the homeless community, especially LGBT teens. and shelters, emergency accommodation for LGBT people has since the cuts started coming in. There's been huge numbers of the services cut, replaced by generic services for all homeless people, which completely ignores the specific needs and the specific risks for young LGBT people. But also, specialist accommodation has been changed from being specialist accommodation. For instance, in Manchester, specialist accommodation is now luxury flats, because landlords wanted to make some more money rather than support LGBT people, and that's in Manchester, a city that's got a huge LGBT population. The increase in free schools and academies really spurred on under the Condemned government, especially by Micheal Gove, who was key in making sure parts of the national curriculum didn't have to be taught by those schools, has led to a rapid increase in homophobia in those establishments, not just amongst students, where it is still high, but especially amongst faculty. There's schools now in the country where being LGBT is only taught in relation to HIV and AIDS, where students in open same-sex relationships are encouraged to seek counselling to make them realise that what they're doing, being in an open relationship with someone of the same sex, is wrong. The attacks on the migrant communities, spurred on by our new Prime Minister Theresa May, is kind of an unseen element of LGBT attack. It's not really focused on a lot of people don't know the stuff that LGBT asylum seekers especially are forced to go through. There's still nearly 80 countries in the world where being openly LGBT can put you at risk of death or prison sentences legally, but many more where being openly LGBT can put you at risk of attack from the wider population. And asylum seekers in the UK face a really stiff battle if they're LGBT being able to stay. Theresa May has really pushed legislation that makes it much, much harder for LGBT people to stay, and there's people like a lesbian asylum seeker that was threatened with deportation because she didn't read the lesbian magazine Diva, and all sorts of spurious reasons to say that someone couldn't be LGBT. Other people said being sent back because even though the courts acknowledged they were at risk of violence if they were lived openly as being LGBT, but said that, well, you don't have to live openly as LGBT, therefore you're not really that at risk, you can go back into the closet. And these are just a very quick overview of attacks in the UK that LGBT people face. Obviously, there's one event recently that's kind of hung over pride events across the world, and that was the mass shooting in Orlando in the US. This mass shooting of primarily Latino people at a nightclub during Pride weekend in Orlando. Obviously it shocked the world. There was a huge outpouring of sympathy and support. Socialist Party in Leeds were at a vigil the Monday immediately following the shooting, that hundreds of people were at, and it was a really positive showing of community amongst LGBT people, and that's because although that attack, and I will go on to the specific context that occurred in America, the threat of homophobic violence is homophobic, transphobic, LGBT-phobic violence is in nearly every single LGBT person's mind. I know, speaking to LGBT people following the attack in Orlando, we were all reflecting on the fears we felt going out in the community, holding hands with partners, worried that get verbally assaulted, physically assaulted. I have been threatened with physical assault numerous times just for looking gay. So this attack really hit home for a lot of LGBT people about how unsafe we can be, even in our own communities, even in our own gay bars. But this attack occurred in a specific context in the US. It was a time of steadily increasing homophobia, especially transphobia amongst politicians. There's been the increasing introduction of trans bathroom bills, essentially banning trans people from really going to any bathroom. They banned from, if a trans man would be banned from going to a male bathroom. You have to go to the bathroom of your gender on your birth certificate. It's really an attack on especially trans women who have been met during all this with a huge amount of prejudice. People who immediately following the Orlando attack were going, "Oh, this is so sad, prejudice is a terrible thing," were even within that same week of the attack talking about how transgender people shouldn't be allowed into any public bathroom, they should have to go to the toilet in the bushes. And it really shows the hypocrisy of a lot of the politicians in America. It's very easy after a tragedy like that to put out a statement saying how horrible prejudice is, but it needs to be backed up by action. And the fact that a shooter felt enabled to attack a gay bar is because of the context of increasing homophobic and transphobic legislation in the US. And it's something Kshama Swan, member of the Committee for the Workers International, who is a city councillor in Seattle, has been really vocal in speaking out against this hypocrisy and speaking out for LGBT people in her community across the US. So there's much more I could say on the current oppression the LGBT community is facing, and it's the fact that I could go on for another couple of hours on this oppression reflects the fact that we are still definitely an oppressed group. Equal marriage isn't the end of the campaigns we need to be fighting for. But why does this oppression happen? Historically, the root of majority of LGBT oppression has come from capitalism and the importance of private property, of passing down inheritance from father to son, has led to a society that pushes the importance of the so-called nuclear family as the ideal family unit, a father, a mother, sons, maybe a daughter, but most importantly sons. And the creation of this male line of succession has put pressure on there to be straight relationships and set gender roles, so this line of succession could occur. And then we had religion to underscore it, create a moral grounding for this oppression. But more recently, the LGBT oppression is coming about through divide and rule. It's not a coincidence that LGBT oppression, LGBT phobia increases during times of austerity. We saw it in the 80s, where as there were numerous financial issues, as there were massive struggles within the working class, that there was a huge increase in homophobia, transphobia across the world, helped by the AIDS crisis. It gave a reason for this oppression. But you had police chiefs, you had politicians in the UK talking about LGBT people as being another element of the enemy within that Thatcher talked about when she talked about trade unions, people who were within society that were seeking to undermine it, that were seeking to break it down, ruin the family unit, spread disease, spread plague, and now we see it again, an increase in attacks. You've seen UKIP really take up that banner that the Tories had. As the Tories have moved more towards the populism, it's become much more harder for the Tories to be openly homophobic, openly transphobic. So UKIP have really taken up that banner, with talk of flooding being the fault of LGBT people. And it's all used to turn sections of the working class against each other, when you can say that the reason you can't get healthcare is because gay men are using it to go get drugs so they can have sex, and trans people are taking all the money so they can get gender reassignment surgery, and all this is completely unnecessary. Gay people can just not have sex, trans people can just stay in the gender they were born in, they don't need to transition. It's much easier to direct people with anger away from the actual source. The reason that there's no money to fund NHS services isn't because LGBT people are taking the money for their services, it's because money's being siphoned out by private companies. Billions are being taken out to pay interest on PFI schemes. Tories are appointing people into leadership positions that are taking millions of pounds a year, just lying in their own pockets. So then, rather than people realise why these attacks are happening and fight back, they instead fight each other. They fight straight people, fight LGBT people, and obviously we've seen the huge fights against migrant communities, black and Asian communities, for taking jobs and homes, and all this is completely spurious. It's just an attempt to divide and rule the population, direct them away from where these attacks are coming from. So how do we fight this? If oppression is still happening, how do we fight it? As indicated at the start of the lead off, through the gains the LGBT community has won over the last few decades. The LGBT community has a strong, really vibrant history struggle. We saw it at Stonewall, where communities, the LGBT community united with homeless communities, united with other underprivileged communities that were being attacked by society, fought back against police brutality, fought back against oppression, and in doing so birthed the Pride movement, birthed LGBT people being really open in society. That was really the moment that LGBT people landed into the national consciousness, and there were early struggles in the Massachusetts society, various other riots that came out in advance, prior to the Stonewall riots, but that carried on into things like the battle LGBT people fought during the HIV crisis in the late 80s and early 90s. Groups like the Gay Men's Health Crisis, ACT UP, taking direct action against politicians who refused to speak of AIDS, or the only time they mentioned HIV and AIDS was to laugh about it in meetings. These groups united with scientists, united with other people affected by the AIDS virus, because the HIV virus affected everyone. United with us and took direct action, occupied hospitals, occupied research facilities, occupied politicians' offices, occupied city halls until they were heard, and through that action they got drugs brought into use, they got laws passed, and they got vital treatment that was needed. And then in the UK, the battle against Section 28, the battle for the age of consent, the battle for equal marriage, the battle for equal marriage fought across the world, and that was really coming out of the HIV crisis, where people weren't able to visit families in hospital. We saw the strength of that battle through the fact that in Ireland, phenomenally, the majority of the population voted in a predominantly Catholic country, a country you might have expected to potentially be more homophobic. You had the majority of the population voting in favour of equal marriage rights and taking the fight against oppressive laws for LGBT people. And the main reason those fights were successful is because the LGBT community didn't fight them on their own. They united with other communities that were facing oppression, with trade unions like we saw in the film Pride a few years ago, and with the whole as much of the wider working class as possible. That's why these battles were able to be won. That's why I'm glad we'll be doing a follow-up video speaking about women's oppression, because it's only through united struggles with the whole of the working class that we'll be able to fight oppression and fight to change society and live in a world where oppression doesn't exist.